The hum of the engine was the only sound she had heard for the last 3 hours. It was a steady, low drone that usually helped her think, but tonight, it just added to the exhaustion. Sandra gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, her knuckles pale against the dark leather. The road stretched out ahead of her, a ribbon of gray asphalt cutting through the blackness of night. There were no other cars right now, just the occasional flash of a distant street lamp and the endless rows of trees standing like silent sentinels on either side of the highway. She glanced at the dashboard. The fuel light had been glowing a persistent, angry orange for the last 10 miles. It was a reminder she couldn't ignore any longer. Sandra let out a long, slow breath, a mix of frustration and tiredness. All she wanted was to be home. She wanted to kick off her shoes, maybe pour a glass of wine, and sit in the quiet of her own living room. But the universe had other plans, and the fuel gauge was demanding her attention first. Up ahead, a small island of light broke the darkness. It was a gas station, looking a bit worn down but open. It wasn't one of the big, shiny chain stops with a fast food restaurant attached. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been there for 50 years, the kind where the paint on the concrete pillars was peeling and the fluorescent lights buzzed with a faint, electric hum. Sandra didn't mind. At this hour, she preferred the quiet. She signaled, even though there was no one behind her, and guided her luxury SUV off the highway and onto the cracked pavement of the station lot. As she rolled to stop beside the pump, the silence of the night rushed back in the moment the engine cut out. It was heavy and thick. She sat there for a moment, just listening. The air inside the car was cool, but she knew outside it would be muggy and heavy, typical of a late summer evening. She pulled the visor down and looked at herself in the small mirror. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes that even the best concealer couldn't hide after a long day of travel. She adjusted the baseball cap on her head, pulling the brim down low over her face. It was a habit born of necessity, a small shield against the world. She stepped out of the car, her sneakers squeaking softly on the pavement. The air smelled of old gasoline, hot asphalt, and the faint scent of pine trees drifting in from a nearby woods. It was a lonely smell. Sandra stretched her arms above her head, feeling the tension in her back pop and release. She looked around the lot. There was only one other vehicle parked near the entrance to the mini-mart, an old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days. The driver was nowhere to be seen. She walked to the pump and fiddled with the nozzle, trying to get the machine to accept her card. It beeped loudly, the sound startling in the quiet, and the screen flashed a message to see the attendant. Sandra sighed. Of course, it was never just simple. She replaced the nozzle and locked the car door behind her, walking toward the glass doors of the small shop. Inside, the air was thick and smelled of stale hot dogs and strong coffee. A young man stood behind the counter, scrolling through his phone with a bored expression. He didn't look up as she walked in. He didn't seem to care who she was. And for that, Sandra was grateful. She moved to the back of the store, opening the glass refrigerator door to grab a bottle of cold water. The chill of the air conditioning in the fridge was a relief against her skin. She grabbed the bottle, hesitated, and then grabbed a second one. It was going to be a long drive still. As she walked back to the counter to pay, she glanced out the large front windows. The highway was still empty. The world felt suspended in time, caught between late night and early morning. It was a strange, liminal space where normal rules didn't always apply. She placed the water on the counter. "Just the gas on pump 4, please," she said softly, keeping her voice low. The attendant finally looked up, glanced at her cap and sunglasses, and nodded. He didn't recognize her, or if he did, he was too tired to make a fuss. He mumbled the total, took her card, and handed it back without a word. Sandra offered a polite, tight-lipped smile and turned to leave, pushing the glass door open. The humidity hit her again. It was like walking into a wall of wet heat. She walked back toward her car, unscrewing the cap of one of the water bottles. She took a long sip, the cold liquid soothing her dry throat. She was just about to swipe her card at the pump again when she heard it. It started as a low rumble, a vibration she could feel in the soles of her shoes before she actually heard the sound. It was distinct, a heavy, rhythmic thumping of engines. It wasn't the smooth hum of a car. It was the aggressive, guttural roar of motorcycles. And it was getting closer. Sandra paused, her hand hovering over the keypad. She looked toward the entrance of the station. The rumble grew louder, echoing off the metal awning above the pumps. The sound was aggressive, piercing the quiet night like a knife. It didn't sound like a couple of friends out for a ride. It sounded like a parade or maybe a storm. Suddenly, the front tire of a chrome-plated motorcycle cut across the curb, followed immediately by another and then another. The quiet gas station was instantly transformed into a stage. The headlights were blindingly bright, cutting through the darkness and casting long, dancing shadows against the pumps. The engines revved, a deafening crescendo that shattered the peace Sandra had been enjoying just seconds before. She counted them as they pulled in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 massive bikes, ridden by men who looked like they belonged to a different era. They were big, burly figures dressed in leather vests and denim, the harsh fluorescent lights of the station glinting off chains, belt buckles, and the chrome of their machines. Sandra instinctively took a small step backward, positioning herself closer to the side of her SUV. She wasn't necessarily afraid, yet, but she was cautious. She was a woman alone at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, and a group of strangers had just arrived with a lot of noise and a lot of presents. It was a situation that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The lead rider, a man with a gray-streaked beard that reached his chest, brought his bike to a halt directly across from her pump. He didn't turn the engine off immediately. Instead, he revved it one more time, a loud, unnecessary blast of noise that made the attendant inside the store jump. Then, with a sudden silence that fell heavy after the noise, the engines died. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't the peaceful silence of the empty road. It was a tense, charged silence. The air felt heavier. Sandra kept her head down, her eyes focused on the pump screen. She just wanted to get her gas and leave. She didn't want to make eye contact. She didn't want to engage, but she could feel their eyes on her. It was a physical weight, the sensation of being watched, of being assessed. The leader of the group swung his leg over his bike and stood up. He was tall, towering over the pump. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his vest pocket and lit one, the flame flaring bright for a second in the dim light. He exhaled a plume of smoke into the night air and looked directly at Sandra. A slow, creeping smile spread across his face, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He took a step toward her, his boots crunching loudly on the loose gravel and pavement. Well, he said, his voice rough and loud in the quiet. Look what we have here, boys. Little late for a solo drive, ain't it? Sandra didn't answer. She kept her focus on the pump, praying the transaction would go through quickly this time. But she knew, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that this interaction was far from over. The silence that followed the man's question was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence, the kind you enjoy on a quiet morning. It was a loaded silence, the kind that makes the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Sandra kept her eyes fixed on the digital screen of the gas pump. The numbers were frozen. The machine was still processing her card, taking its sweet time, unaware of the tension building just a few feet away. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge the comment. It was a survival tactic she had learned over the years. Don't engage. Don't make eye contact. Make yourself boring. Make yourself invisible, and usually they move on. But these men weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for an audience. And right now, she was the only show in town. Hey, I'm talking to you, sweetheart, the leader said. His voice was rougher this time, carrying an edge of annoyance. He took a step closer, his heavy boots scraping loudly against the concrete. The sound was jarring. You think you're too good to say hello? Sandra's heart gave a nervous flutter against her ribs. She took a slow, steady breath, trying to keep her hands from shaking as she pressed the cancel button on the pump. If it wasn't going to work, she just needed to leave. She could come back later or find another station. Being polite was one thing, but being cornered was another. I'm just getting gas, she said, her voice quiet but firm. She didn't turn to look at him. She kept her focus on the nozzle, pretending to check if it was properly seated in the tank. It's late. I just want to get home. The man chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that started deep in his chest. Just getting gas, he mimicked, pitching his voice high and mocking. Listen to that, boys. She just wants to get home. Behind him, the other 4 men were off their bikes now. They weren't doing anything threatening, not exactly. They weren't drawing weapons or yelling, but they were spreading out. It was a subtle movement, like a pack of wolves circling. One leaned against the concrete pillar supporting the awning, crossing his arms. Another drifted toward the back of Sandra's SUV, looking at the license plate. A third moved to the other side of the pump, effectively blocking her path to the driver's door. The dynamic had shifted. What started as a loud entrance was now a controlled enclosure. Sandra could feel the walls closing in. The bright fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz louder, casting harsh shadows that made the men look larger than life. "That's a nice car," the man standing near the back of her SUV said. He ran a gloved hand along the bumper, the leather making a squeaking noise against the paint. "Bit fancy for a place like this, isn't it? You lost, princess? This isn't the kind of neighborhood where people drive toys like this." Sandra finally turned. She kept her sunglasses on, hoping they acted as a barrier. She pulled the nozzle out of the car and hung it back on the pump, the metal clanking loudly. She screwed the gas cap back on, taking her time, buy herself second to think. "I'm not lost," she said, turning to face the leader. "I'm just passing through. If you could excuse me, I need to get back on the road." The leader looked at her. He was squinting, trying to see past the sunglasses and the baseball cap. He was looking for something, a crack in the armor, a sign of fear. Or maybe he was just trying to place her face. Sandra was used to people staring, used to the scrutiny, but this was different. This wasn't a fan looking for an autograph. This was a predator sensing weakness. "You got a lot of attitude," the leader said, stepping closer. He was close enough now that she could smell the mix of stale tobacco, motor oil, and cheap beer on him. It was a pungent scent that made her stomach turn. "We're just being friendly. You know, making sure a lady alone is safe. This highway can be dangerous at night." He reached out, not touching her, but tapping his finger against the side of her car, right near the window. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythm that was meant to unnerve her, and it was working. "I appreciate the concern," Sandra said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She gripped her keys in her right hand, the jagged metal edges digging into her palm. It was a small comfort, a tiny weapon if things went wrong. "But I'm fine. Please let me pass." The man standing by the pillar laughed. "She wants us to let her pass. She's giving the orders now." The leader didn't laugh this time. He looked at the man blocking the driver's side door. "What do you think, Joey? Should we let her pass?" The man named Joey, a shorter, stockier guy with a bandana tied around his head, grinned. He didn't move. He just leaned back against the door, crossing his arms over his chest. "I don't know. I think she owes us an apology for being rude. Maybe she should take off those glasses and say sorry properly." The air grew colder. The teasing was gone, replaced by a dull, menacing reality. They weren't going to just move. They were enjoying this power play. They had the numbers, they had the size, and they had the territory. Sandra realized that waiting for the pump or trying to reason with them was useless. She stood there, a small figure surrounded by leather and denim. The heat of the day had vanished, leaving only the cold humidity of the night. She looked at the entrance to the gas station. It was empty. The highway was still deserted. The clerk inside was invisible behind the glass, probably pretending he wasn't seeing any of this. "Look," Sandra said, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. She decided to appeal to their ego, a trick she had seen in movies and hoped worked in real life. "I'm sorry if I was rude. It's been a long day. I just need to get home to my family. I'm sure you guys understand. You probably have families waiting for you, too." For a second, there was a pause. The mention of family was a calculated risk. Sometimes it humanized a victim, reminded the aggressors that she was a person. Sometimes it didn't matter at all. The leader looked at her, tilting his head. He chewed on the inside of his cheek, considering her words. Then he spat on the ground, just inches from her sneaker. "Family," he scoffed. "That's cute. You see, we are family. We're the only family that matters out here." He took another step, and this time he was well inside her personal space. He reached out a hand, moving toward her sunglasses. "Now, why don't you show us some respect and look me in the eye when I'm talking to you?" Sandra stiffened. She pulled her head back slightly, her body tensing up for a confrontation. She wasn't going to let him take her glasses. That was the last barrier between her and the situation spiraling out of control. She tightened her grip on the keys, holding them like a claw. "I said no," she said, her voice sharper now. "Get back." The leader stopped, his hand hovering in the air. His eyes narrowed. The amusement was gone. Now he just looked angry. The atmosphere was electric, with the promise of trouble. "You little," he started to say, leaning forward. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension. It wasn't the roar of a motorcycle. It was the deep, rhythmic thrum of a heavy engine, different from the high-pitched whine of the bikes. It was a sound that vibrated deep in the chest. Headlights swept across the gas station lot, casting long, bright beams that momentarily blinded the group. The bikers turned their heads, shielding their eyes from the sudden glare. The leader dropped his hand, turned to see who was interrupting their game. A large, shadowy vehicle was pulling up slowly to the pump directly behind them. It moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, not rushing, but asserting a presence that was impossible to ignore. Sandra froze. She didn't know if this was help or just more trouble. But as the vehicle rolled to stop, the engine idling with a low, menacing purr, the dynamic of the entire night shifted. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. They were watching. And this time, they looked wary. The heavy engine of the truck cut out, and for a second time that night, silence rushed back in to fill the void. But this silence was different. It wasn't the lonely, vulnerable silence Sandra had felt earlier. It was a charged, electric stillness, like the air right before a thunderstorm cracks open. The bikers stood frozen in their semicircle around Sandra. The leader, who had been all confidence and swagger just a moment ago, took a half-step back from her. He narrowed his eyes, trying to peer through the glare of the headlights to see who had interrupted their fun. The bright beams cast long, distorted shadows of the men across the concrete, making the scene look like a gritty painting in black and white. A door clicked open on the truck. It wasn't a slam. It was a deliberate, heavy sound. A boot hit the pavement. Then another. A figure stepped out from behind the glare, walking slowly into the pool of fluorescent light under the gas station awning. Sandra felt her breath catch in her throat. She didn't know who this was. A part of her feared it was another member of the gang, perhaps someone higher up the chain, arriving to make things worse. But as the man stepped fully into view, that fear began to shift into something else, confusion, and then a spark of recognition. He was tall. Not just tall, but imposing. He had the kind of build that suggested he spent serious time in the gym, but he moved with a fluid, athletic grace that didn't look stiff or bulky. He was dressed in dark jeans, heavy boots, and a leather jacket that looked well-worn and comfortable. He didn't have a helmet in his hand, suggesting he hadn't been riding a bike, but he carried himself with a kind of road-worn toughness that wouldn't be out of place on a highway at 2 a.m. He didn't look at Sandra. He didn't look at the gas pump. His eyes were locked entirely on the leader of the bikers. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked. His voice was low and smooth, lacking the gravelly rasp of the biker. It wasn't shouted. It was spoken with a calm, terrifying certainty. It was the voice of a man who wasn't asking a question because he needed an answer. He was asking because he was giving a warning. The leader of the bikers straightened up, trying to recover his composure. He puffed out his chest and flicked his cigarette onto the ground. "We're just talking to the lady," he grunted, his voice raising an octave in defensiveness. "Ain't no problem here, man. Just mind your business." The stranger didn't move. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides. He looked almost bored, but his eyes were alert, scanning the group of 5 men with a tactical precision. He noted where each man was standing. He saw the one by the pillar, the one near the back of Sandra's car, and the stocky one blocking the driver's door. "She looks like she wants to leave," the stranger said, his tone remaining perfectly flat. "You're blocking her car." The biker called Joey, the one blocking the door, shifted his weight nervously. He looked at his leader, waiting for an order. The dynamic had shifted. The power had been with the group, in their numbers and their noise. But this new arrival was a variable they hadn't counted on. He didn't look scared. He didn't look like a passerby who would be easily intimidated. "We're just having a conversation," the leader said again. taking a step toward the stranger, tried to reclaim his territory. She was rude. We're just teaching her some manners. The stranger tilted his head slightly. He took one step forward, closing the distance between himself and the leader. It was a subtle movement, but it was aggressive. The leader flinched, a tiny movement, but enough to show he was rattled. Manners, the stranger repeated. Is that what you call it? 5 guys against 1 woman? That doesn't look like teaching manners. That looks like a mistake. The air grew tight. Sandra watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that face. She knew that stance. The recognition was washing over her in waves. But the situation was so surreal, she could hardly process it. What was he doing here? How was this possible? The bikers, however, were still catching up. They saw a guy in a leather jacket. They saw a threat to their authority. You want to make something of it? The leader spat, his bravado returning because his crew was watching. He puffed up his chest, trying to use his height to intimidate, though he was still a few inches shorter than the stranger. You got a death wish, buddy? We outnumber you. The stranger didn't blink. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't clench his fists. He simply exhaled, a short, sharp breath through his nose, like a bull getting ready to charge. I don't need a numbers advantage, the stranger said quietly. I just need you to step away from the car. The tension snapped tight. The biker by the pillar pushed himself off the wall and moved to flank the stranger. The one near the back of the SUV began to creep closer. They were trying to encircle him just as they had done to Sandra. Don't do it, the stranger said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried clearly across the concrete. He turned his head slightly to look at the man trying to flank him. I'm not the one you want to test tonight. There was something in his eyes, a darkness, a history of violence that was barely leashed. It was the look of a man who had seen real danger and was impressed by the theatrical posturing of a small-town biker gang. The biker by the pillar stopped in his tracks. He had seen that look before, maybe in movies, or maybe in the eyes of people he actually respected. It was the look of genuine capability. Sandra saw her chance. The driver's side door was still blocked by Joey, but Joey was distracted, his eyes glued on the standoff between his leader and the stranger. She gripped her keys tighter, the metal digging into her palm. Joey, the leader barked, sensing his control slipping. Move the bike. Joey blinked, snapped out of his trance, and looked at the stranger, then back at his leader. He hesitated. For a second, the outcome hung in the balance. Would they fight? Would they back down? The stranger turned his gaze back to the leader. He smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold and sharp. Last chance, he said. The leader looked at the stranger's hands, resting calmly by his sides. He looked at the stranger's eyes. And for the first time that night, the leader of the gang looked uncertain. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights seemed deafening. Who are you? The leader asked, his voice losing its aggression, replaced by a suspicious curiosity. The stranger didn't answer. He simply stepped to the side, clearing a path, and gestured towards Sandra with a tilt of his head. Let her go. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And as the words hung in the humid night air, Sandra watched the realization begin to dawn on the biker's face. He was looking at the stranger, really looking at him, perhaps recognizing the jawline, the intense eyes, or the unmistakable way he commanded a space. But the recognition wasn't the important part yet. The important part was the fear. The leader had realized that they had pushed the wrong person on the wrong night, in front of the wrong witness. The game was up, and the stranger was holding all the cards. The silence that followed the stranger's command was thick, almost suffocating. It was the kind of silence that happens in the middle of a storm, right before the wind changes direction. The leader of the bikers stood his ground, but the confident sneer on his face was faltering. He looked the stranger up and down, trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense to him. The stranger didn't move a muscle. He didn't need to. He stood with an effortless stillness that was far more intimidating than the biker's loud posturing. His hands hung loosely by his sides, open and relaxed, but his eyes were locked onto the leader with a focus that was laser-sharp. It was a gaze that said he had seen worse things in dark alleys than a group of bullies at a gas station. The biker named Joey, who who had been blocking Sandra's door, was the first to crack. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking nervous. He stared at the stranger's face, squinting to the haze of the fluorescent lights. You could almost see the gears turning in his head. He was looking past the beard, past the casual clothes, trying to place where he had seen those eyes before. "Wait," Joey said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It was a sound of sudden, dawning realization. He reached out and grabbed the leader's arm, tugging it frantically. Boss, look." The leader shook Joey off, annoyed. "What?" he snapped, not taking his eyes off the stranger. "No, really. Look at him," Joey insisted, his voice trembling slightly. That's him. From the movies. You know, the guy with the gun. The one who you know." The stranger didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just watched them. The leader frowned, turning his head to look at Joey, then back at the stranger. He studied the face again. The strong jaw, the intense, dark eyes, the calm demeanor that seemed to radiate a quiet, dangerous power. And then the realization hit the leader like a bucket of ice water. His eyes widened slightly. The color seemed to drain from his face, washing away the aggression and leaving only shock. This wasn't just some random guy passing through. This wasn't a traveler they could push around. This was a man whose entire public persona was built on being the toughest, most unkillable action hero on the planet. In the movies, this man took down armies. In the movies, he was the one you called when you wanted the impossible done. The reputation was larger than life, and standing there in the flesh, he seemed to carry all of that weight with him. The leader suddenly felt very small. He realized he was standing toe-to-toe with a living legend, a man who was known for his discipline and his skills just as much as his acting. "Keanu," the leader breathed out. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of surrender. The name hung in the air, and the reaction was instant among the other men. The biker by the pillar straightened up, his arms falling to his sides. The one near the back of the SUV took a deliberate step backward, away from the car, away from Sandra. The dynamic had completely flipped. A moment ago, they were the wolves circling a helpless sheep. Now, they were the ones who realized they were in the presence of a lion. Sandra stood frozen by her car. Hearing the name spoken aloud confirmed what she had hoped but hadn't dared to believe. She knew him, of course. She knew him better than anyone in that crowd. They had shared screens, they had shared laughs, and they had shared a history that went back decades. But standing there, seeing him transform from a shadow into a protector, she felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost knocked the wind out of her. The stranger, Keanu, finally moved. He didn't make a threatening gesture. He simply took a slow step to the side, opening a clear path to Sandra's driver's side door. He never broke eye contact with the leader. "I think you and your friends were just leaving," Keanu said. His voice was still quiet, but it carried the weight of iron. It wasn't suggestion. The leader swallowed hard. He looked at his crew, then back at Keanu. The fight had gone out of him completely. There was no scenario in his mind where this ended well for them. Even if they outnumbered him, this was a battle they couldn't win. You don't fight a legend in a parking lot and walk away with your dignity. "Yeah," the leader mumbled, looking down at his boots. We were just going." He turned to his men and made a frantic motion with his head. "Come on, get on the bikes. Now." The transformation was jarring. The men who had been looming and aggressive just minutes ago were now scrambling. They fumbled with their helmets, their hands shaking slightly. They avoided looking at Sandra. They avoided looking at Keanu. They just wanted to be anywhere else. The engines roared to life, but this time the sound wasn't triumphant. It was a retreat. It was the sound of a pack running away with their tails between their legs. Keanu stood like a statue, watching them. He made sure every single one of them mounted their bikes. He watched as the leader kicked his starter, the engine sputtering for a second before catching. The leader gave one last, sheepish look at Keanu, gave a small, apologetic nod that was barely visible, and then revved his engine. One by one, the motorcycles rolled past. They didn't speed. They didn't do burnouts. They rolled out of the gas station lot with a quiet, hurried rumble, turning onto the highway and disappearing into the darkness from which they came. Sandra watched the taillights fade into the distance, twin red dots swallowed by the night. The roar of the engines faded, replaced once again by the buzzing of the fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the highway. Only then did Keanu Reeves turn to look at her. The hard, dangerous expression on his face melted away instantly. The action hero vanished, replaced by a warm, familiar smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He walked over to her, his boots making soft sounds on the pavement. He didn't look like a warrior anymore. He looked like an old friend who had just happened to stop by. "Hey, Sandy," he said softly, using a name only her closest friends used. "You okay?" Sandra let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for hours. Her shoulders slumped as the adrenaline left her body. She pulled off her baseball cap, running a hand through her hair, finally letting herself just be a person again rather than a target. "Keanu," she said, her voice shaking slightly. I didn't know you were there. I didn't know you were in town." He shrugged modestly, shoving his hands into the pockets of his leather jacket. "I was just riding. Saw you pull off the highway. Thought I'd say hi. Then I saw those guys." He didn't brag about the confrontation. He didn't mention the fear he had put into them. He just treated it like a minor inconvenience he had handled. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt far too small for what had just happened. "They weren't. It wasn't good." Keanu nodded, his face serious again for a moment. "I know, but they're gone now." He gestured to her car. "You should probably get going. It's late. Where are you headed?" "Home," she said, a small smile finally touching her lips. "Just home." "Good," Keanu said. He took a step back, giving her space to get into her car. "Drive safe, okay? And maybe lock the doors." Sandra opened her car door, the interior light flooding the dark pavement. She looked at him, this man who had been her co-star, her friend, and now her knight in a leather jacket. It was a surreal moment, the kind that felt like a movie script itself, but the reality of it was grounded in the genuine kindness in his eyes. "See you soon, Keanu," she said. "See you, Sandy," he replied. As she climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door, she watched him walk back toward his own vehicle. He didn't hurry. He moved with that same calm, grounded pace he always had. Sandra started her engine, the familiar hum of her SUV a welcome sound after the chaos of the night. She pulled out of the gas station, glancing in her rear-view mirror one last time. She saw Keanu standing under fluorescent lights, watching her go, making sure she was safe. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. The night was still dark and the road was still long, but the fear was gone. She wasn't alone on the highway tonight. She had a guardian angel in a leather jacket, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never forget the night the biker gang messed with the wrong guy. The highway stretched out before her, like a black ribbon cutting to the dark landscape, but for the first time since she left the airport, Sandra felt like she could breathe. The gas station was miles behind her now, a bright memory fading into the distance, but the sensation of the encounter lingered on her skin, like a chill that wouldn't quite go away. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles slowly returning to their natural color as the adrenaline drained out of her system. The car was quiet, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of her own breathing. She reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed the bottle of water she had bought. Her hands were trembling slightly, a delayed reaction to the fear she had been suppressing. She unscrewed the cap and took a long sip, the cold liquid grounding her in the present moment. It was strange how quickly life could pivot. One minute she was just a tired traveler, anonymous in a baseball cap, and the next she was the center of a potential crisis. But the strangest part wasn't the harassment. It was the rescue. She shook her head, a small, incredulous smile playing on her lips. Of all the people in the world to pull into a lonely gas station at that exact moment, it had to be him. It felt like a plot twist in a movie that she herself would have turned down for being too unrealistic. She glanced in her rear-view mirror. The road behind her was empty for a long stretch, just the red taillights of a distant semi-truck. Then she saw it, a single headlight, bright and steady, weaving through the lanes about 100 yards back. She didn't need to guess who it was. She knew the silhouette of the rider. He was keeping his distance, maintaining a respectful gap. But he was there. He was making sure she got on the main highway safely. He was making sure the bikers didn't circle back. It was such a simple, decent thing to do, yet in an industry often defined by ego and superficiality, this genuine act of kindness struck a chord deep within her. Sandra settled into her seat, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to uncoil. She thought about the look on the bikers' faces. It wasn't just fear of physical altercation. It was a shock of realizing they had picked a fight with someone they admired on screen. It was a strange modern paradox. People feeling a personal connection to a face they only knew from a cinema screen. But tonight, that connection had worked in her favor. A few miles down the road, the lights of the city began to bloom on the horizon, washing out the stars with a warm, orange glow. She was close to home now. The safety of her neighborhood was just minutes away. She signaled to exit the highway, slowing the SUV down on the off-ramp. As she came to a stop at the traffic light at the end of the ramp, she looked in the mirror again. The motorcycle pulled up behind her. The rider didn't rev the engine or try to pull alongside. He just waited. The light turned green, and Sandra turned left, heading toward the winding roads of the hills where her house sat. The bike followed. When she finally turned into her long, private driveway, she stopped the car for a moment before pulling up to the gate. She watched in the mirror as the motorcycle slowed to a halt at the entrance of the driveway. He didn't come up to the house. He had done his job. He had escorted her home. Sandra put the car in park and rolled down the window. The night air was cool and smelled of damp earth and leaves. The rider lifted a gloved hand in a small wave, and then he turned the bike around in a smooth arc. "Keanu!" she called out, her voice louder than she intended, breaking the silence of the night. The bike stopped. The engine idled a low, steady purr. The rider didn't take off his helmet, but he turned his head slightly, acknowledging her. "Thank you," she shouted, the words feeling insufficient for the weight of the night. "Really, thank you." He revved the engine once, a short, sharp sound that seemed to say you're welcome, and then he was gone. He disappeared back down the hill, the red taillight fading into the darkness like a dying ember. Sandra watched the empty road for a long time. The silence of her neighborhood wrapped around her, protective and calm. She rolled up the window and drove the rest of the way to her garage. When she finally stepped out of the car and into the safety of her own home, the reality of the night settled in. She locked the door behind her, engaging the alarm system, a ritual she usually did without thought. But tonight it felt significant. She walked into her kitchen and turned on the lights. The house was clean, quiet, and blissfully normal. She placed her keys on the counter and leaned against the cool granite, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding for hours. She pulled off her baseball cap and tossed it on the counter. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. It was a text message from an unknown number, though she had a feeling she knew who it was. She smiled when she saw the screen. Asterisk, safe and sound. Don't worry about the noise. Just get some sleep. K asterisk. She hadn't given him her number, but she wasn't surprised he had it. In their world, connections ran deep. She typed back a quick reply. Asterisk. I owe you dinner. A big one. Drive safe. Asterisk. She set the phone down and walked to the living room, sinking into the soft cushions of her couch. The encounter had been terrifying in the moment, but now, wrapped in the safety of her home, it felt like a story she would tell at dinner parties, a reminder of the strange twists life could take. But more than that, it was a reminder of friendship. It was a reminder that even in a world that often felt isolating and dangerous, there were good people, people who would stop in the dark, people who would stand in the gap between fear and safety. The headlines tomorrow would be about movies or awards or the chaotic pace of the modern world. But for Sandra, the only thing that mattered was a quiet hum of a motorcycle engine fading into the night, and the knowledge that she wasn't alone. She closed her eyes, the exhaustion of the travel finally catching up to her. But for the first time that night, she slept peacefully. The highway was behind her, and she was home.